ring of the bell brought the attention to all on the surface. A clatter and the loud whirring of the electric winch roared into life, echoed across the yard. Trucks banged into each other as the green engine shunted them together. Kazni Howen provided lead, which the Mid Sodor Railway used as their sole goods contract. There were whispers that things were becoming more unstable. The mines that had helped win the war were all closed now, as their mineral deposits dried up. Kazni Howen was the only mine that still had a source of mineral, and that was still going strong. While a lot of people still hoped the line would bounce back, this didn't seem the case, as now only 3 engines were working the rails. 2 men on break sat in the shade of the office buildings, eating their meager lunches. Soon discussion opened up between them about the railway and its engines.
I say, whatever happened to number 2?
One miner asked.
It went in the loo, of course.
The other said with a chuckle.
I mean the second engine of the railway, you twit. I've seen those 2 young ones and the grumpy old Duke, but never that other green engine. The one that looks like that other engine on the other railway in the middle of the island.
What? Didn't you hear? The new number 2 got turned to a generator a few weeks ago.
What? Never? So soon too?
Yes, put him behind the shed. Turns out they needed it to power the workshop. They said that engine would be more useful than that yank-built piece of junk.
I can still hear yous, you know.
Stanley shouted. The men's gaze turned to face the pumping shed. Since the mine ran close to underground streams, and mines were always in danger of flooding during periods of heavy rain, it was important to pump the water out of the mine. The old steam engine that had powered it when the mine had opened had broken down years ago. In order to keep the mine operating and the goods traffic it provided the railway, the manager had sold their old generator engine to the mine. The engine itself glared angrily from behind the wall built in front of him. His former red paint had faded into a dull, greyish pink, thanks to the sun and rock dust.
Besides, it ain't my fault this stupid railway can't handle some spills, or can make the time to fix me up properly to be useful,
he continued angrily.
Heh, I remember one of your spills.
One miner said, chuckling his harsh smoker's laugh.
You dropped some rocks in the line, and Mig took have an axe in it, set a pasture through one of the windows, and they almost bled to death.
That was an accident. I told the crew they was overloading the trucks, but no one dares to listen to me and I get the blame for it.
If you weren't such an horrid, awkward engine, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. If you were a more sensible engine, like Duke...
Duke. Everybody puts so much faith in that old geezer. I bet that engine causes plenty of accidents on a daily basis, but nobody dares give him a scolding. All cause he was named by the Duke himself. He gets a free pass.
He would never! You know how he feels about his grace.
And that's another thing, that Duke. That guy was nothing but just a normal fella. Nothing extraordinary about him. Just cause Duke is named after some old guy who ain't even done anything to prove himself that he's worthy of having a grand title, he gets all the polishes and repairs he could ask for. The world bends over to make sure that old groaner stays in one piece. What did I get? Nuts. All I get told is stop riding so roughly and stop swaying side to side. Nobody even cares when I say my wheels are off center, or how these stupid rails are too shallow and they need fixing. Instead, I get yelled at and told I'm the incompetent one.
Rubbish! Any proper engine would know how to be careful.
No proper engine could work on this line even if they tried.
And what about Stewart and Falcon? They work just fine.
Same goes for Falco and Stewart. They all get the attention, so they ride easily on this line. Just cause they are young and impressionable little brats, they get coddled.
Ugh, no wonder they put number 2 behind the shed. With an attitude like yours, I couldn't tell either of you apart.
Stanley's face went bright red.
Smudger was his name, not number 2. Me and Smudger, we want to be useful. We want to work hard and make this place a proper railway. And what do we get in return? We get squat for repair, get nothing but abuse, and get turned into useless junk. How can we be really useful engines if we're not on our rails?
The miners, having endured all the arguing they were willing to put up with, looked at each other. and one smirked. He turned to Stanley and said,
Because without wheels, you can't do anything but be useful. Too bad they didn't brick your ugly mug up too when they put you there. You talk too much anyways. Hardly useful.
The two men chuckled as Stanley stared dumbfounded at them. His face stuck as one of shock, then sadness, then anger.
You really thinks that without wheels I can't do nothing but be useful? Well, I'll teach you. I'll teach all of you. I might have lost my wheels and rails, but I can still do a lot.
Stanley yelled. The miners just laughed as they stood up and walked away, back to the elevator and work. Stanley seethed in fury, steam hissing from his fittings.
This railway wants to treat us engines like we're nothing but spare parts. All I wanted after the war was to be really useful for a good cause that wasn't for God or country, and this is the thanks I get? Well then, I'll show them what happens when this really useful engine decides he's had enough. Either I get my wheels back or this line goes down the tubes. Frankly, I'm not opposed to either option,
he muttered darkly. A year passed, and then in the cold, dreary month of December, the winter storms hit the island. It was cold, but never cold enough for the rain to turn to snow. Despite the miserable weather, work carried on. Men went up and down the lift, dragging lead out and loading it into trucks. From the pumping shed, hissing and clanking could be heard as the men forced the engine to pump the icy water out from deep in the mines. A torrent of angry curses from within, coming down as heavily as the rain, followed day in and day out. Until one day, the swearing stopped. So did the flow of water from the drainage pipe. The pumping engine broke down suddenly. Without a pump to remove the water, tunnels quickly became flooded in cold, murky water. Men drowned trying to swim to safety, or became lost when the tunnels flooded and collapsed. All that time, Stanley just smirked, as the men tried everything to fix him, to make him work. The men yelled at him, berated him, accused him of doing this all on purpose, cursed at him in all of the local languages. And all that Stanley said in return was,
Listen, bud, I don't care a dime for a few drowned rats.
The fuck you say to me, you little shit?
Eventually, the rain stopped, but the grim work continued for the next few days of trying to rescue the trapped men and recover the bodies. Soon the mine was forced to close down, as worries about the safety of the mine came into question. The owner did so in the hopes that recovering the dead wouldn't cost more lives in the process. This work would continue only after an inspection was performed the following day. Everyone headed home, leaving Stanley alone. Not that he minded, he was still feeling so very proud of himself.
This'll show them,
he said to himself. Night soon fell, and the moon shone down overhead. The temperature dropped, and mist began to form. It wasn't a very thick mist, but it did make the quiet mind feel a little eerie. Stanley was sleeping when a low noise woke him up.
Eh? Who's there?
No one replied. Before Stanley could close his eyes again, he felt the ground shake. He knew the feeling of rock being blasted, but this was different. It felt drawn out and not as powerful. He wondered what it could be. As he was pondering this, a low noise drew his attention up again. It was like the sound of a heavy train rolling along in the distance, but not entirely, as there was no sound of wheels on rails or chattering trucks. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. Stanley closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. But then the sound returned. This time it came in different pitches. The deepness of the sound changed often and never stayed the same. It sounded alive.
It's nothing. It's nothing,
Stanley muttered to himself. But even as he tried to convince himself of this, the sounds continued on and on, getting louder and louder. It never seemed to stay still, but it moved around. At times it would be right under him, and then it would be across the yard near the offices. Stanley looked up to see the water tower behind the showers suddenly tilt to the side, freezing at an angle.
What the hell is...
Stanley's eyes darted towards the shaft elevator. The lone lamp that hung near the gate swung wildly, flickered, and then cut out. But even without the light, Stanley saw what was happening as the shaft elevator frame shook in the moonlight before violently lurching to the side and sinking downwards into the ground. His eyes widened as the rumbling grew louder and moved around. While he'd never experienced the cave-in at the mine, all this sound and movement and that low sound that changed and sounded less like the earth heaving, but the sound of men talking, screaming, bellowing. There was no way this was a simple cave-in.
They're coming for me.
Windows shattered in the office building as one of the stone walls bulged outward and fell down into the mist, not forming a pile of rubble as it should have. A set of buffers in the yard suddenly vanished from sight, sinking into the mist like it was a fishing bob being yanked under. Some trucks on the siding creaked and groaned as they began to slowly roll in the direction that the buffers had been. Then they suddenly dropped out of sight, smashing sounds hinting at their fate. Stanley felt his shed vibrating harder now. Grout fell from between the stones, tiles rattled and smashed onto the ground. His tall, rusty funnel shook. He could feel the vibrations through the pump he was attached to, something hitting the metal pipe that went deep into the earth. Before the engine could say anything, he was struck by a sudden sensation of movement, for the first time in years. Only wasn't anything like he'd ever felt before. It was a sudden downward movement, a falling sensation. The shed vibrated, crunched as its stone wall suddenly collapsed inwards on itself, the roof falling down and crushing the workable and gutted water pump the men had been trying to fix flat. To Stanley, the ground seemed to rise upwards around him. Only he knew too well the ground wasn't rising, he was sinking. In no time at all, the only thing he could do was look upwards as inky blackness surrounded him. He opened his mouth to scream, but dirt and rocks piled up around his mouth, smothering it. The moon shone brightly overhead, the edge of the hole he was in rapidly shrinking until the bright white orb in the sky was snuffed out. All Stanley could sense now was the steady downward sensation, and the muffled stillness of the earth that enveloped him all around and grew heavier and heavier. The next morning, men returned to the scene of devastation. Huge holes had suddenly appeared in the ground where once no holes had existed. The rails were bent and broken, some hung freely, spanning massive gaps. Parts of buildings were gone, the shower house half hung over a massive pit where the remains of the water tower lay at the bottom. The elevator was half the height it should have been, and was tilted at the most unnatural angle. But miners felt something was missing. Upon turning their eyes towards one of the larger pits in the ground, where once the pumping shed had been, there was only a massive hole, with a few broken roof slates sitting in the middle. Upon seeing the devastation, the owners immediately closed the mine forever, deemed unsafe. The workers were paid their last paycheck, while the families of the dead were paid the full amount for an entire year of work. Kasni Hawan lead mines quickly ceased to be, and come the new year, the Mid Sodor closed its doors for good. Without a mine to serve, the engines were sold, rolling stock scrapped, and the rails torn up. You wouldn't have even known a railway had once been there. For years after, talk of the disaster would be whispered in taverns all over the valley. Of the poor men who'd lost their lives, of the men who'd lost their jobs, and rumours of the old mine being haunted. Stories that, on a clear night right after the days of rain and the mist rising around the old mine, a sound can be heard. A sound that comes from below the ground, from one of the many sinkholes where a building once stood. A sound of muffled cries, wailing in the darkness. As to whether these stories are true or false, no one can say.